All right, 5 W's of decoupled websites. Here we go. Rachel.
I will take the wheel now. Hello, my name is Rachel Cherry. I'm a freelance software engineer and online accessibility specialist and consultant. I do a lot of work with WordPress and a lovely app called Gatsby. I am also the fair leader of this party and as the director of WPCampus.
And Steve Persher, Technical Product Marketing Manager at Pantheon. Pantheon is a web ops platform for Drupal and WordPress. We see it as our mission to make the open web a first-class platform that delivers results. And in short, we think that decoupled architectures, front-end first tooling will be a big part of how we go about fulfilling that mission, especially over the next decade. Real quick Pantheon plug if you're not familiar with us. I was first a Pantheon customer before I was a Pantheon employee. I like the idea that I could push my well-formed PHP code up to Pantheon, not worry about PHP INI configuration, MySQL configuration, get a dev test live workflow out of the box, and see all my sites in one dashboard. If that sounds appealing to you, check us out at pantheon.io. The TLDR of this presentation, this is going to be a relatively high-level introduction to decoupled websites, running through the 5 W's here. What we're talking about is essentially a separation of code bases and architectures that serve your public-facing site, separate from a content editing experience in WordPress, for instance. The why for why you might do that, in short, we think it's to deliver the best possible user experience. And I think a key part of that is being able to change the front end faster when you decouple. Ideally, doing a decoupled architecture will involve everyone on your web team. This is a decision that should be made in conjunction with anyone whose job it is to regularly make changes to the sites. Lots of places you can put a decoupled architecture that we'll talk about. When to do this, ideally when your goals align with an architecture like this, and the how, ideally one step at a time. So diving in deeper here, what is a decoupled site? In short, again, what we're talking about is a split between content editors going to a CMS backend, be it WordPress, Drupal, or something else. That's separate from the general public going to a front-end experience built probably these days in React or Vue.js. Both of these should be sitting behind a content delivery network, and our front end here is reading in data from the backend CMS, potentially at runtime, potentially at build time. So to talk about that nuance a bit here, one more specific model is what I like to call the idea of a parallel dynamic runtime. The idea here is that we again have that split between backend and front end, and a key part of the split is what language or what runtime is used on each side. We've got these great open source CMSs built in PHP, WordPress, Drupal as well on Pantheon. Front-end focused sites these days are probably going to be written primarily in JavaScript. We may need Node.js to execute React components or Vue.js components server side. Another variation on how you might go about decoupling is called progressive decoupling. This is a term that Dries Boytaert, founder of the Drupal project, has been talking about a lot for a number of years, and I think it could apply just as well at WordPress. The idea here is that we have a WordPress site, it's got a header, it's got body content, it has a sidebar, and perhaps we decide just this sidebar section would be more compelling, better built in React or Vue.js. And piece by piece, block by block, widget by widget, perhaps, we decouple our website. Another option is, again, that hard split between backend and front end. The distinction here is that that front-end experience could be static. It could be compiled. It's possible that when the general public is hitting that website, that there's no compilation happening on demand. It happened in a build process. Gatsby seems to be the most popular option for this model in the Drupal and WordPress space. and it's what WPCampus used. And I'll turn it back over to Rachel to talk about some what's as well here.
So my part in all this is that WPCampus decided to decouple our main website. It is the only one of our websites that is decoupled, www.wpcampus.org. You can check it out. It's super fast and pretty. So I'm going to give a little bit more of the other kind of end of that. So the what in my story is, well, one of them is WordPress. So what is WordPress in this story? It is a coupled monolithic end-to-end content management system. And when we say end-to-end, it's really kind of drawing a picture of that back end that Steve was talking about with the front end. But WordPress is an all-in-one application that powers a back-end interface to manage content and a front-end environment to display it. So this is a very visual interpretation of that. You can, next slide, please. So you have the back end. So a lot of us are familiar with this admin experience. This is what the admin for the main campus website looks like. And it manages your content. It's what might also be called your data layer. You manage your users and your plugins, lots of metadata. Next. And then you have your front end, which is where the public visit your website. It manages the design and the presentation of your website. It's very public facing. You might, in a WordPress world, your WordPress theme might power your front end. Lots of HTML and CSS and JavaScript galore. So, what are the pros of using WordPress in this particular context when you frame it as a coupled monolithic end-to-end CMS? Well, everything you need is together in one place, which is probably one of the most popular reasons why someone might use WordPress. There's lots of options included and plugins, themes to install, and so it's really a great resource to have to quickly put together a website. So, why is that a con? Well, everything you probably don't need is together in one place. WordPress comes with a lot of stuff, and you may not necessarily need all of that stuff. And so the monolithic application can become quite bloated and sometimes hard to control if you don't know what you're doing. So the other what in our story is introducing Gatsby, which Steve mentioned. It's an open source static site generator based on React, and it is more of a front end tool that is built to consume your content from WordPress, and it will generate HTML and a build process that you can then place on your server to display your content. And one of the big reasons for Gatsby is that it really prioritizes front end performance. So this is a nice little illustration. If you're unfamiliar with how Gatsby works, it literally downloads your content from WordPress, usually using like a REST API or GraphQL, which is also an API. It pulls that down and downloads it. Then it intermingles it with your templates and your design, your CSS, and it creates HTML files that you would then place on your server. So on your front end, as Steve mentioned, you're not doing any, you're not really generally requesting information on the front end. You've already got the information, you've already compiled it exactly how you want it, and then you're displaying it, which makes your website really fast. So a little bit of our why did we do all this? Why did we redesign? Our website was 5 years old. So, I'm sure a lot of folks have the same reason. You want something new. We had outgrown our website a long time before that. We wanted to rebuild our design and our information architecture, but mostly we also wanted to learn something new. Why did we want to decouple? Well, we really loved having more control and flexibility on our front end, the increased performance. I, for one, was getting really frustrated with plugin bloat on my front end. When we actually flipped the switch, I took a screenshot of how many extra CSS and JavaScript files were being loaded on every page of our website, even though they were not necessary. It was somewhere between 20 to 40 files. And that kind of stuff is really hard to control in a WordPress environment. But in a Gatsby type environment, you have much more control. You only use what you need. And we wanted to explore more modern web technologies, play around with JavaScript and React. I, for one, wanted to become comfortable with web components. And again, all this comes back to just wanting to learn something new and play with new tools. So a refresher, why do we need WordPress as an organization? Well, one, we like to use it, but the big thing is we need WordPress. We need the same reason most people need content management systems is that you need a way to manage content with multiple editors. This is why WordPress is so popular in higher ed. It's because we need systems where we can have very spread out editors manage content. We have a large number of users and we have vast amounts of numerous data types, i.e. custom post types and such like that. And again, why Gatsby versus like Steve mentioned Vue or maybe something like Next.js or whatever. I had become very interested in Gatsby as an organization because they have a high dedication to accessibility. And I was really intrigued by a lot of the performance statistics that I was seeing online. So to kind of group up the advantages of decoupling your website, you can really take advantage of these tools for what they were really built for. Content management systems are ultimately built to manage content. So use WordPress as a powerful CMS to solely manage your data, make your admin sleek and, prioritize how your data is structured, have a nice user management system, output your data with the REST API. Then take advantage of tools that were built for front-end performance like Gatsby and other JavaScript frameworks and other tools that use them to manage how you present your data. It can be really lightweight. You can have more control over what gets shown on your website because you know what's going on, and you have more flexibility also to experiment with a wide variety of frameworks. You could much more easily interchange your theme of your site to use different tools because of how you've separated your content from your design.
And taking another angle on the question of why and starting to bring in the who here, I'd like to think about things from the perspective of site visitors and the devices people are using to access these websites. As a web developer, getting started in my career, as new devices like the iPhone were coming out, I think I underestimated the scope of change or the scope of challenge that devices like the iPhone and the iPad represented. I thought, well, responsive design seems like a challenge. Making these sites squish, we need to do this on a slow mobile network. I think that was too narrow of an understanding. These devices represent more than just another screen size to deliver. The browsers are underpowered, partially because these device makers are strongly incentivized to push people towards native applications. The native applications that we often use on a daily, hourly basis give us often a deeper connection to the companies funding the technology. The websites that we build as web developers need to deliver more types of value in order to compete with native applications. And often front-end first or decoupled architectures can put you in a better position to do that. So just some of the types of value that we need to deliver through a website, especially a university, needs to deliver nearly every type of value through a website. A university is going to need to bring back students over and over again to the website, especially during this pandemic here. There's a need to track daily active users. There's a need to encourage the next incoming class to apply to become students. To do that, you need unique users reached, you need the tools of lead generation, you may need to sell sweatshirts online, and even if a university website isn't going after ad revenue, the homepage itself of a university website often has essentially ad slots built within it. university websites can be incredibly complex, and often that complexity and the need to compete on each of these fronts with native apps or social ads requires just the best tools available. It also requires that the people building the sites be able to focus as much time as possible on that top level reason the website exists. What's the impact that the website is there to create? It can be difficult to focus on that top level reason the site exists if the web team is focused just on getting changes out the door or focused just on making sure that the website isn't crashing. Often, I think decoupled architectures can enable a team to move up this hierarchy faster. A big part of that is often because the deployment workflows for decoupled architectures can be shorter and safer. At Pantheon, we think it's a good idea that nearly any change you would make to a Drupal or WordPress site go through this this deployment pipeline of multi-dev to dev to test to live. And in each of these environments, you might ask a different question, like, does this change meet my team standards? Did I break anything? And ultimately, what we're trying to avoid with a deployment pipeline like this is breaking your database or breaking the live website in a very damaging way. If a website is split such that the front half, the public-facing side, is unlikely or incapable of breaking the database, then it may be acceptable to have a one-step deployment pipeline where you can make a change that's meant to increase one of those conversion metrics, consult with your team, and if you like it, move it live in one step. Teams need to complete these cycles of designing, building, and measuring changes to their sites faster and faster. At one point, it was a leap forward to be able to make changes to a website on an every 2-week basis at the end of a sprint rather than at the end of the month or at the end of the quarter. But the expectations for the pace of iteration are only rising. And there are a few team members that I think particularly benefit from faster, shorter cycles of designing and building and measuring changes. So the people asking for changes to your website are going to benefit a whole lot. If you demo a new feature to a stakeholder, they're probably going to want to see it on the live site as soon as they say it's good to go. They may not want to hear that their change now needs to wait 2 more weeks to actually be deployed live. Designers, I think, can greatly benefit from this faster iteration cycle. If you can make CSS changes and get them live near instantaneously, it may be acceptable to deploy imperfect CSS changes and iterate based on public feedback rather than trying to get something perfect without it ever going live. Front-end developers probably benefit most from this kind of architecture. Front-end developers, I think, have been given an incredible challenge in the last decade, keeping up with the number of devices, the number of browsers, the amount of nuance on the front end. It's no longer realistic, in my opinion, to expect front-end developers to also learn all of the implementation details, all of the layers of WordPress. There are so many tools that have come out in the last decade specific to front-end development. And I think it's important to recognize that this was not the result of capriciousness. This was not arbitrary. This was front-end developers recognizing that the challenge of building good websites, especially on mobile devices, was huge and got significantly harder in the last decade. That's why we needed this burst of new tools. Now, a decade plus into decoupled architectures, I think React and Vue.js seem to have risen to the top as far as front-end frameworks go. I'll toss things back to Rachel now for more answering the question of who.
So the who for us was the team that we assembled. We assembled a working group once we decided that decoupling was this future we wanted to research. We created a Gatsby app and began to experiment with it. But the big important things for our team was auditing our existing content and functionality to make sure we knew exactly what we are getting into. Because as we'll discuss throughout the rest of this presentation, it is work. So we needed to make sure we knew what we were getting into, and we also researched potential concerns and limitations, which I'll talk more about here in a minute. The where, it is important to recognize that if you are going to decouple especially your WordPress website, if you're going to decouple it, you might need a new hosting environment, because you now need to host this very different set of files. WordPress is very PHP application, and now over here in Gatsby land, we have HTML files with CSS and JavaScript. Not necessarily can't be hosted together, but it introduces a new layer that you will need to research. We reached out to Pantheon because Pantheon has hosted our website for a few years now, and been a great partner of ours. And so we decided to go down this journey together to figure out how Pantheon might host our decoupled environment as well.
Yeah, and as I've been talking with teams doing decoupled architectures, it's been a common pain point that I've heard, that especially that role of the system administrator or the DevOps engineer has to ask, well, where's this stuff going? And many teams choose to put their applications directly on AWS or Google Cloud or Azure. And I'm not expecting anyone to read this diagram here. Just what I want to illustrate is that it can be incredibly complex to take ownership of each piece of infrastructure necessary to run a Drupal or a WordPress application in AWS. If you chop the site in half and then say the front half requires something nearly as complex, you're keeping that system administrator deep in the weeds and away from being able to focus on, again, the top level reason that the site exists. There are some great front end focused products out there. Companies like Netlify and Vercel have really optimized for the front end experience. But in talking with teams building these kinds of sites, I've heard over and over again that it can be difficult to have WordPress in one place and your front end, your Gatsby somewhere else, and perhaps a build process or a Git repository in a third and fourth place. That's why we think we'll be able to add value by putting back end and front end together in one place on Pantheon. We've been doing research and development to this end, and we'll have more to share in the months to come. We think being able to have either a static or that dynamic runtime environment under one roof will be a big differentiator. Sticking on the question of where, one question I've been asking for a number of years is, if we're cutting off WordPress's head, where is WordPress neck? The conversation that can happen between backend and front end developers in a monolithic site can get very complicated as you try to decide at which layer of WordPress does a certain thing happen. Is it happening at the level of a Gutenberg block? Is it happening at the level of a widget? With decoupling, with cutting off WordPress's head and having something like the core REST API or GraphQL as a plugin, a clear point at which you move from data in the backend to being sent out to Gatsby or any other framework, that can help shape the conversation between backend and front-end developers of if we need to customize a certain part of a component, is that customization a data customization that needs to happen inside WordPress, or is it happening in the front-end component after the data moves out of the API? The marketer or the site owner role may start asking questions as they hear these conversations about chopping WordPress in half. Why why use WordPress at all? And Rachel touched on this a bit earlier, that WordPress has been managing content for nearly 2 decades. WordPress is pretty darn good at the problem space of managing content, managing roles and permissions. Also, the open source nature of WordPress is something that I don't think should be given up lightly. If we're chopping away the head of WordPress, the heart that's left over, I think, is the open source flexibility, the open source control that you get, along with the content management features that WordPress is most well known for. So when is it a good idea to decouple? I think in short, when decoupling will move you closer to your goals. That may mean that there's a level of interaction design that's going to be difficult to achieve in monolithic WordPress and more achievable in React or Vue.js. You may need to simply iterate on the front end independent of the back end. Sometimes a monolithic site may be a better answer if you know exactly what the website needs to be and you know it's not going to change significantly. But if you're unsure exactly what your site needs to be and you need to evolve it quickly, decoupling may be the way to go. Performance we've touched on as well. And also if you simply have a decoupled team, a clear line between back-end and front-end developers. Sticking with the theme of when, I would say please not all at once. Some of the teams I've talked to have gigantic Drupal 7 sites that have built up layers and layers of complexity, and their plan is to move all of their content all at once to Drupal 9 and Gatsby at the same time. I think that's too much all at once. Getting into how here, I think it's important to validate some baseline assumptions in smaller steps. If there's an assumption that decoupling is going to get people more engaged with your site, can you validate that in a small way by perhaps decoupling just a single page or a single component? If you've got the assumption that your developers are going to collaborate faster, that's something that you could check also by making a small change. Your content editors may not really know what they're getting into until they try it. So if you could even just set up a test instance of WordPress and Gatsby together, that could be worthwhile. For Pantheon's own delivery plan, our own how, we've been first working with a small set of customers on pilot projects, WPCampus included, and soon we'll be doing custom delivery through our professional services team, and simultaneously we're building out a full product offering coming soon.
Awesome.
Rachel, what is your answer to when?
I don't have too much to add to what Steve had to share. And really, the when is, it's a very personal question. When you understand what's involved, because there is work involved. When you've researched how much work needs to be done, when you've figured out what hosting will look like, but most importantly, when the move makes the most sense for your team. And so really only you can answer that, and after you've done diligent research. So moving on to the how, I do have very much information to share on that regard. We did a lot of work and learned a lot of lessons. One of the big early lessons you really learn is you're not in WordPress anymore. So one of the potential concerns of the decoupling process is that you are leaving the WordPress front end, and therefore you no longer have, access to HTML markup or functionality that belongs in the WordPress application that's provided by third-party plugins or WordPress core. You no longer have built-in user authentication out of the box, so to speak. That was a big hurdle for us. You no longer have things like built-in live preview of content. These are just a few examples. With all that said, these problems can be solved, and so it's just a matter of how you solve them and how much work you're willing to do. And what path you walk down. The problems that we faced specifically was we very much underestimated how challenging it would be to decouple web forms. Our solution ended up being, for the moment, we ended up implementing iframes because it was way too much work. It, again, not impossible, just very complex. We have a wide variety of forms. I am a big fan of Gravity forms because of the work that they do for accessibility. And so we have many forms that have many various field types, and it would have taken us months to completely rebuild the front end process outside of WordPress. So that's how we solved it momentarily with iframes. User authentication is complex. We ended up building a single sign-on process using a WordPress plugin. So our WordPress environment is an authentication source for us, and that worked out really well. We also had to get rid of comments, but to be quite honest, we didn't really use them. If you rely on comments, there are definitely solutions. There are third-party solutions you could use. I'm not really familiar with the WordPress Comments REST API and how easy that would be to implement with a separated front end, but for us, it was just worth it to just get rid of the comments because, again, we didn't really use them. So with our time left, I was just going to kind of run down a list of the tools that we use to solve all these problems and the very specific kind of things that we came in contact with during this whole project. For one, we now had 2 websites, we now had 2 applications, and therefore we needed 2 website domains. So WPCampus.org without the www is our WordPress application. And then our Gatsby application lives at www. I would have preferred it the other way, but Steve and I had a long conversation about that because we also have a multi-site network, and so we couldn't quite change our main domain so easily. So we use the headless mode WordPress plugin to take care of any redirects. Basically what happens on the WordPress app is, if you are a certain type of user, which is mostly me, you can still access the front end of the WordPress app sometimes, but otherwise everything else gets redirected to Gatsby. We also have particular instances where we actually are still using the WordPress app to control some front end components. For example, those iframes that I mentioned earlier. So some pages are allowed to go, some domains are allowed to access the WordPress application, and that's what this plugin helps us do. It helps us tell it which domains can make it through and which domains are sent to Gatsby. So how we displayed the web forms, a little more specific, we basically created very minimal WordPress page templates. We placed Gravity form shortcodes inside those said templates, and we used those URLs inside Gatsby as iframes. We built a iframe web component, or actually it may just be like an NPM JavaScript thing that helps us display those iframes really easily on the Gatsby app. So to get the data we need from WordPress, as I mentioned, you do have to download all of your data from WordPress in order to feed it into Gatsby's build process. We right now use the WordPress Rest API. We have a few custom REST API endpoints that we use to really customize our data. The WordPress REST API is a pretty nice tool, but it does have some limitations. If you have a lot of data or a lot of complex data, you might have to create your own endpoints. We use the Gatsby source WordPress plugin, but I hear tell that it has been updated or it's being updated, so we might have to do some work on that soon. We do restrict, I lock down our WordPress REST API. You may not necessarily need to do that, but I like the idea of doing that. We use the WordPress REST API Authentication plugin. It does a pretty good job. So OAuth is how we do our single sign-on process. I really like this process. It also helps us better improve our iframe experience in the sense that our users are signed in to WordPress and Gatsby, and so when forms are displayed inside of Gatsby that are coming from WordPress, WordPress knows they're logged in and can actually populate fields in our forms. So we really like this functionality. I use the WordPress OAuth Server WordPress plugin. I will admit that I forked it a little bit, but not very much. out of the box, you might be able to use it to fit your needs just fine. On the Gatsby side, I used the client OAuth 2 NPM module to handle the OAuth. On the JavaScript side, I did not have to fork it. So we needed to set up a way to trigger a Gatsby build. So you'll want to trigger a new Gatsby build anytime you either A, update or change content, or B, update or change code. And so these are two different areas. One is a WordPress admin where we actually change our content. And then one is a GitHub repo where we change our code. So inside of whenever we change code, we use Circle CI to trigger the build. And so whenever we commit code to our GitHub repo, it triggers a build inside Circle CI that Pantheon set up for us, and then it syncs the final build files to our server. When we want to trigger a build from updating content, then we have a WordPress plugin that Pantheon built called Build Hooks, and it allows us to have a button inside of our WordPress admin that all we have to do is go to that page in the admin and press the button. And then it's the same process. It triggers the build inside of our Circle CI environment, which then syncs the final results over to our server. I wanted to share some stats with you. Our average build duration from me triggering the build to it being live on the website is a little over 2 minutes. It takes about 30 to 40 seconds to set up the actual build environment. It then takes about 50 to 60 seconds for the entire actual Gatsby build, and then about 10 seconds to sync all of the files and deploy them to the server. The results were really cool to look at. We did a lot of performance testing before we switched to the decoupled setup. And so, I'm an accessibility specialist, so we were covered there before. We were 100 and 100, no worries there. But our performance was really struggling, and a lot of that had to do with what I was mentioning earlier, where we had just uncontrollable amounts of CSS and JavaScript files that we were constantly having to remove and dequeue and manage, and it was really frustrating. On the Gatsby results, the only one that's not 100 is performance, and the only reason it got a 93 is because when we first launched, and it's still there, I believe, we were using Google Fonts to house our fonts because I didn't have time to go out and set up my font file. So we'll get around to that eventually, and then we will have hundreds across the board. Cool.
Thanks so much.
Work out who was going to say thank you.
We can thank each other.
Let's see. I'm going to put our faces back on the screen, and hello everyone, and I'll look to see if we had any questions. I checked earlier. So let's see. Oh, we do have some questions that came in. All right, we have 2. So if we run a WordPress multi-site network, is it possible to decouple just one website? Follow-up, is it a good idea? The answer is yes. That's exactly what we did. Campus has a multi-site network with about 12 sites. I think this Campus 2020 site is the most recent one, and it is number 12 in our blog ID. So we have a pretty large multi-site network. We've had it for a while. It runs really great. We love it. And the site that we actually decoupled is the root site, the #1 blog site. So we were able to do that with the only, even remote. Actually, there was no drama about it. We just had to, come to a decision about, domains. And I wanted to switch, and I wanted, the WordPress app to have the www because I don't like having wwws in my domains. I'm just weird like that. It's a personal preference. But after talking with Steve, it was like, Rachel, it would be so complicated to have to switch that out and not really worth it. And so the voice of reason came through. So yes, it is possible. It works just fine. And so to hope that answers your question. I wouldn't stop that. Let that stop you. Do you have anything to add to that, Steve?
I think it's the way to go. I think if you've got a big site network, absolutely start with one to validate that the change is worthwhile. I wouldn't want to decouple 100 sites in a site network and then find out, oh, this isn't just exactly what I thought I was getting into.
Can you imagine, like, if I don't even want to imagine decoupling all the sites on our network. So every other site on our network is WordPress, and it works fine. And maybe one day we'll move them, maybe we won't. So stay tuned. But we did really enjoy the process. So I really wanted to get the 2020 site into Gatsby, but there just wasn't enough time to deal with everything. So okay, one more question. If you were building a brand new decoupled site today with no existing content, do you think you would still choose WordPress for the CMS? I mean, honestly, like that really just, it depends on the site. I mean, you know, pick the tool that you need, the right tool for the job. And while we all love WordPress and it's great, it's not always the right tool for the job. You know, sometimes you don't need, you know, a monolithic CMS type system. You don't even, you know, maybe it's just you managing your content, or maybe it's just you and one other person, or maybe you want to manage your content in a GitHub repo. People do that all the like. There's tons of ways to manage content and do it in a way that's version controlled and user managed. So,
yeah. I think depending on the site, putting all the content in Git in the same Git repository as Gatsby can have a lot of advantages. One of the customers I've been talking to has a site that will be relevant for their organization for like 4 months. It'll need to stay on the internet for much longer than that, but it's essentially it'll be a brochureware site that will be very important for a short period of time, and then that's it. And doing it in Gatsby, doing all the content in line in the same Git repository, I think it's just a better option, because that split is valuable, I think, over the long term when you have content editors signing in and you need sensibly structured content. But if you just have a small team building a website and you just need to get it done as fast as possible, maybe it's okay to have a messy mix of content and templates. Like the hard separation between what is content and what is code is sometimes valuable, but for a site that's only going to be relevant for 4 months, figuring out exactly where the line is for every single component may not provide any value at all. And then after those 4 months are done, the site can just sit as flat files in perpetuity, and that's the safest and often cheapest way to run a site.
Yeah, that's a great example. My personal site is just a Gatsby app, and I host my content in Markdown files because I don't need I don't need to manage an entire WordPress application just for like my 8-page, you know, portfolio site. You know, like so it really depends on your site. Before we go, we're the last ones. We can go over a couple of minutes if we want. We have one more question come in. What are security implications of decoupling? Pros and cons?
One pro, that front-end experience can again be done as all static files, and you can lock down WordPress if you want. You could run WordPress behind a firewall. You could, as Rachel mentioned, put a password on the REST API and make it so that none of the content is directly accessible. Cons, you might want WordPress sitting there publicly available, and then you may run into cross-domain complexity and pitfalls.
I will say, like, basically, you know, we still ended up having a fair amount of, you know, front-end real-time interaction between our Gatsby and our WordPress, especially with wanting to have single sign-on for user authentication and setting all that up. And So there's you could almost say, like there's more information coming out of our WordPress app than there was before, like being sent out to other websites, than there was before. So so there's definitely, you need to be mindful of that and, protect your data if you are going to if you're just going to have like a WordPress setup where the REST API, is just being downloaded in your Gatsby build and then not being accessed client side, then it's a little, it's a little less concern. You can still lock down your REST API and give the Gatsby build a password kind of thing. You can do stuff like that. But I would be mindful of the fact that in a decoupled world, heading down that path, you are having more exporting of your data from your site than you might have had keeping it all within the WordPress family, so to speak. And so be mindful of what kind of risks you might be opening up your data to. All right, that's all I have. Thanks, Steve, for doing this with me and for all the help you've given us on our project. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
Bye, everybody.